Welcome to AsiaEdit et al., the podcast that brings you research publishing tips direct from industry experts. I'm your host, Trevor Lane. Hello, joining me in this podcast is Dr. Hilde van Zeeland, an applied linguist at Writefull, which is a new editing software owned by Digital Science. It has both free and paid options as a plugin for Microsoft Word, and the Overleaf LaTeX platform is designed to be a specialized academic grammar and spell checker, and it uses AI technology. So let's find out more. Hi, Hilde. Welcome to the show, and thanks for being our guest today.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd like to start off by asking how and why Writefull was created and what it offers beyond regular grammar and spell checkers.
So Writefull was created when myself and one of the co-founders of Writefull were doing our own PhDs. Of course, we had to do a lot of academic writing, a lot of papers and the thesis itself, and we struggled with it, also being non-native speakers of English. And so we thought there must be a way to kind of bring together knowledge about language, because I was doing a PhD in applied linguistics, and computer science, which is what Juan Castro, one of the co-founders, was doing. And so we basically came up with Writefull, which initially used corpus linguistics, so statistics about language use, to help people with their writing. So how it now differs from regular grammar checkers is mostly in the focus on research language. So it really gives feedback tailored to scientific language. And the feedback that it gives today is very advanced AI-based feedback. So it really uses the latest AI that you can find when it comes to language feedback.
Okay, great. We'll discuss the AI part more later. Now, as an applied linguist, what would you say are some main language differences between academic and general written English? And what are some common style errors that English learners make?
I think there's a lot of differences, but I guess one of the main ones is the frequency of the vocabulary used. So we see in general English and in spoken English in general that the frequency is quite high of the vocabulary. So it's really a lot of common words. And of course, in academic writing, it's often discipline specific and lower frequency vocabulary. So the same meaning, but words that you don't meet very often. We also see that there are phrasal verbs are a lot less common in academic writing than in other types of writing. Doesn't mean that they can't be used, but sometimes, for example, point out you can have in academic writing another phrasal verbs still occur, but they're a lot less common than in general English. In terms of some of the common style errors that English learners make, I guess that is also related to that. You sometimes see sentences in academic writing that sound a little bit informal still, or where you see that authors try to use formal language but struggle to do so. So you get a bit of a strange mix sometimes between formal and informal language.
Okay, so an example of informal and phrasal verb that you wouldn't write in an academic paper would be something like put up with something rather than tolerate.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good example. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if Writefull is added to Microsoft Word, is it easy to use, and what editing functions are available? And does it work with track changes?
Yeah, so once it's added to Word, it's very easy to use. So you basically see it at the top in the ribbon. You can choose to have your entire document checked, so all of the language and all of the paragraphs, or just a small section or just one paragraph of your text. And what you then get to see is the language suggestions to the right. And there are two language modes that users can choose. You have the proofread mode and the full edit mode. And the full edit mode is a more advanced language mode that we recently launched that really goes beyond the typical grammar check and that really looks at the word use, the word combinations, the flow of the sentences, and that can really offer full sentence rewrites. So that is the more advanced AI part that I also mentioned earlier. And track changes are indeed also supported, but that's only in the Windows version of Writefull because Mac doesn't support track changes.
So for either the proofreading or editing function, does it show it in the document and it shows changes and then you have to accept or reject each one by one, like a track change document? Or does it show it in a different window and you have the choice to accept or reject each one one by one?
Yeah, so if you use the track changes, it really works with track changes. So you really hover and then you can accept from there within the text. If you use one of the two modes, then you get to see the suggestions in a panel on the right-hand side of the document, and then you basically accept or reject them from there.
Okay. Now, apart from proofreading and editing functions, does the software also give other educational tips or explanations for the corrections?
So it doesn't, because it uses, especially the full edit mode, it uses this full AI approach. The suggestions are basically very free. So it doesn't use grammar rules to say, this is where you need to add an article or a comma, and this is why. It uses free AI. And for that reason, we also can't say, this is why we are giving this edit. So that is, you could say, the disadvantage of just using AI and no rules, that you don't really know beforehand what the tool is going to give in terms of feedback. But especially for people who are still new to academic writing in English, we do also offer two other widgets that we call the language search and sentence palette. And language search is really a search box that users can use to just look for words and phrases to see how commonly they are used in academic writing and how they are used. And the sentence palette is a collection of very common phrases and sentences that can be used in the different sections of a paper or a thesis. So these two really have pedagogical value to the users.
Okay, yeah. I did actually download it to test. So the sentence palette is like phrasebooks, academic phrasebook.
Mm-hmm.
You'd learn certain phrases from a phrasebook if you went abroad on holiday, and it'd just be some useful phrases. They don't work all the time, and you have to adapt it, but it's a good basic start. And then the other function is like a concordancer. It would find words or phrases, and then it would give a sample of sentences where it's found. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can also put like an underscore to say, what word fits this context, or even, a star before and after a word to get to see what synonyms of a word fit a certain context. So it really helps you to think of alternative ways of saying something.
Okay. Now, can you briefly explain the main differences between the paid and the free versions of the software?
Okay, so they are basically very, very similar. The main difference is that with the paid version, you get more of the same. So with the free version, you get a subset of the language suggestions, and you also get limited results in the sentence palette and language search. And with the premium membership, you basically get to see all of the suggestions and all of the search results.
Okay. Now, how does Writefull actually perform the checks? Do you have to be plugged in online? Is it a live online checking? And in that case, is the text that's being checked kept confidential?
Yeah, so everything is live online. So the text is encrypted, sent to the servers, it's processed, the feedback is given, and it is, again, encrypted, sent back with the feedback. So you do have to have an internet connection, but we do not store any of the texts or the suggestions that are accepted or rejected. And we get that question quite often, of course, especially because much of the data is highly confidential, because we are talking about manuscripts that often haven't been published yet. So we are very aware of this, and we do really treat them with a lot of care.
Okay, that's good to know. But how about what type of information do you analyze for what users are using?
So what we analyze is just the basic activity of how often do people log in, right? How often or how long do they use the app for? Usually, do they use it for a few days? Do they use it for a few weeks? So because that is relevant for us to know what is an active user. When do we know that somebody is liking the tool? So that's the information that we do store.
Okay. Now, does the software include plagiarism screening, text match screening?
No, it doesn't. No, it's really only language support. We know that there are many other tools on the market that already offer this to users. We do have one service called Writefull Cite. What Writefull Cite does, it basically processes all of the sentences in a text. And it uses AI. We've trained our own model for this to basically evaluate if there is no reference in the sentence, should the author have included a reference? So is there some information presented in the sentence that needs to be backed up by a source? And it doesn't use another database of texts for this. It really looks only at the sentence itself. So that is Writefull site, but that is separate from the Writefull app with the language check. So we do offer this, but only for institutions.
That's interesting. So now we did mention AI. So how exactly has the Writefull software been trained by AI? Does it judge, I think you did mention it judges by frequency rather than any programmed grammar rules?
Yeah, so basically it's not necessarily the raw frequency counts or anything, but it basically learns, through having processed all of these sentences from all these manuscripts, it can basically recognize it when a sentence doesn't really follow the patterns that it has seen. So indeed, no grammar rules, also because grammar rules, there is just no end to it, because with just grammar rules, you will never cover everything that language can do and all the ways that people can write something. So you will always fall short. So yes, it is full AI that it has been trained on.
Okay, and your website says that it's been trained on millions of published research articles as reference text. So I'd like to know what types of articles were used, and were they only from publicly available peer-reviewed journals?
Yeah, exactly. So it's all open access peer-reviewed articles that we could basically get access to. So one of the providers is Hindawi. They offer their manuscripts online to be used, to be processed. So that is one of the sources that we used to train. That is one of the data sources.
Okay. Now, related to that, well, of course, we know not all journals are peer-reviewed, or not all journals perform copy editing, and published papers can still have language mistakes. So does the AI take that into account, or how are humans involved in fine-tuning the quality?
So yeah, you do indeed. A peer review doesn't always guarantee that a manuscript is also well written. And we also cannot guarantee that before, adding it to the actual training set. So what we do is me and another applied linguist in the team, especially at the very beginning when we were still collecting and starting the training, to basically process the output of the models and look at different manuscripts from different fields, from different authors with different first languages. And we would literally count occurrences of different feedback types and see where do the models fail. Is there, for example, with articles, we very often saw at the beginning that the models would overuse these. So they would very often add a the or an before a noun where it was okay, but it wasn't really necessary. So we would just mark all of these cases, which was a very laborious task. And then, our developers would use that to tweak and fine tune the models. And that is how we make sure that the quality is high and stays high.
All right. Now, related to that, what challenges did you meet or have to consider when you designed the software? Is it sensitive to different disciplines or article types, or general versus specialist language?
So for the training set, we basically just put all of the data together. So no distinction between different disciplines in terms of the models or the language feedback. We have afterwards tested it on manuscripts from different fields, and we don't see a difference. So it works good for STEM, and it works also well for arts, humanities, social sciences. What we do see sometimes is that formulas, for example, or other objects in text can be quite challenging, because sometimes they are included in manuscripts as images, and in that case they are just taken out, which also makes the sentence incomplete. Or sometimes they appear in the plain text that we use for training as different symbols, and then we also can't really read them as normal language. So that is just a tricky thing that you get when you work with text that has formulas or symbols in them. So that is something that we do find with the training and also with the output, and that we are also constantly working on.
Okay, and from press releases, it says that Writefull has just been launched, but has it actually been around before now? So what was the recent launch, and how has feedback been about how it works?
Yeah, so Writefull as an app has been around for several years. It used to be called Writefull app, and it was just the statistics offering this language search engine. What we recently launched is called Full Edit, and that's really a new, fully AI-based mode of language feedback that I also mentioned earlier. And that has indeed been analyzed by several parties. We've had a big publisher looking at it, 2 scientific language editing companies, and another general copy editing company. And they basically looked at Writefull and several other language tools to see how well do they work and which ones should we be using to either triage manuscripts that are submitted or to actually help in the copy editing process. And all 4 found that Writefull is definitely better than the other tools. So that's very positive news for us. And that is about the new full edit mode. So what we generally do here is that, especially copy editors who themselves manually copy edit manuscripts, they often say, we didn't know that AI could do this, that it would already be this advanced.
Oh, so how are copy editors using it? Is it like a first pass and then they tidy it up later?
Yeah, possibly. Some of them do it like that. Some of them really do it also for the entire copy editing process. So they just use Writefull to first check the manuscript. They look at the changes, or sometimes they just accept the changes. And then, of course, they do their own human check as well.
Okay. Now, how about in the future? What improvements or extra functions are you planning?
For Writefull, one of the first things that we want to add is the British American option, so that as an author you can also choose, or as a journal, as a publisher, you can choose, this is the check that I want. It's something that we have ready in the backend, but just needs to be still pushed to the actual apps. And we've also been working on some separate widgets, such as an automated paraphraser, also for scientific writing, which we also plan to probably add to the apps at some point in the future.
So right now, what spelling does it rely on for UK or US?
So right now it doesn't make any distinction. So it's mostly American, because that is what most of the training data has been on. But that is something that in the back end, we basically need to say, okay, so in the front end, people using the app need to be able to choose. And then in the back end, we solve that for them. So we only push edits that are really following one of the 2.
Okay. And do you have any special programs or schemes right now? How is Writefull being especially used to help researchers who have English as a second or foreign language?
So it's not necessarily only for non-native speakers, but I do think that most of the authors using Writefull are non-native speakers of English. We also hear from publishers that use Writefull before submission. So they offer Writefull to their authors for a quick language check before they submit their manuscript. We also hear from publishers that often they do that mostly to reduce the language barrier, because they also realize that sometimes poor language quality can make it harder to really assess the content of a manuscript. And they also, of course, see this as an issue, and to give everybody fair chances to have their manuscript fairly evaluated, they use the language check for that purpose.
Oh, so there's some publishers using it as a screening tool? So does it give a score or something?
Some, yes. Some use it really to triage, so to get a quick view on the quality of a manuscript that is submitted. But many actually offer it to authors. So authors, when they're about to submit a manuscript on the submission page of a journal, they get a pop-up or another notification saying, before you submit, perhaps you want to run your manuscript through Writefull to hopefully improve the language of your manuscript.
Oh, so before they submit, they have an extra checking revision step to try to reduce desk rejection. Okay, now more generally, how can you see AI playing a part in academic publishing in the future? And are humans still needed for either editing and quality control or other decisions?
Yeah, I do think that AI, we also see it, right, that it will get more and more important in scientific publishing. It is already used to check language, to revise language. I think that it is also going to be used to do an actual language check across a manuscript. For example, to see, are there sentences that perhaps contradict each other? We also know that AI is advancing quite rapidly when it comes to auto-summarization. So I can also imagine that it might soon also be used to help authors with writing their abstracts, for example. You also have tools, and we also do this at Writefull, to offer automated structural checks on manuscripts. So those can be basic, are the tables in, are the references in, are the authors in, etc. So that's not AI. But I think AI is also going to become important in structural checks. For example, does this snippet of text give an accurate description of this table? that is AI, because you need to recognize what's in the image, and you need to understand the text that goes with the image. And that can all be done, at least partly, automatically. So not really to replace editors, but definitely to make the processes more efficient.
Okay. Now, in the meantime, what advice do you have for listeners who are currently or soon to be preparing manuscripts in English?
Yeah, I think it's important while writing to try to focus on the content first, because I think especially when you struggle with writing, especially when you're a non-native speaker of English and perhaps your proficiency level is not very high yet, it is tempting to try to get the language perfect from the very beginning. But it's best to first write the content, even in a brainstorming way, then write up, and then use as a third step just to polish. And then when polishing, you can either use Writefull or use any other language tool that you prefer to make sure that the language is correct. But it's important to not start with that, because that can really break the whole writing flow.
Yeah, I agree. And finally, what got you interested in applied linguistics? And what has your own experience been as a researcher using English as a second language?
I think I've always been interested in how people use and learn a second language. Even in secondary school, I was already very aware of how our English teacher would teach us and how different pupils would deal with the material without really knowing that that was actually a field of study. I only discovered that later, that there is something called applied linguistics, and that's actually about how do people use and acquire a language. So that came later. I do think also that when I started really writing academic texts in English, I was also quite aware of how I was learning the language to use. So at the time, I would use Google a lot, and I would just Google phrases and words to see how people would use them. And that's also how we started Writefull a bit later. I think that also works quite well, to try to also focus explicitly on how do people write, how do people actually use this word. I learned a lot from that personally.
Oh, so your native language is what?
It's Dutch.
So your native language is Dutch. And at what age did you start learning English at?
Yeah, I think, the TV and the radio, everything here is, a lot of the media is actually in English. So it starts early, but it's only really, the end of primary school that you start really using English.
Okay. Now I have an odd question. And what language do you think in? Or does it depend on whether you're writing in English and then you think in English?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think mostly in English, especially when I'm working.
Okay, so Hilde, thank you so much for being our guest today and for also offering some language and writing tips. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the AsiaEdit et al. Podcast. For more publishing advice, visit AsiaEdit.com. I'm Trevor Lane, and I hope you tune in next time for more expert publishing tips.